Hello, my name is Pat Bryant. I am an alum of WKY TV. I started working there back in the spring of 1974, June 3rd, 1974 to be exact. But let's go backwards a little bit. Some information that kind of predates my days at WKY. I remember as a kid growing up in Billings, Oklahoma, we'd watch programs on Channel 4 a lot. The TP show, Championship Wrestling with Danny Williams, and other stuff like that. I seem to remember as a little kid, I would run home from school every day so I could turn on the TV, and at that time Channel 4 was running the old Superman TV show in the afternoons, and I always had to catch that. That was pretty cool when I was a little kid. And then as I was growing up, I remember a lot of times in high school, I'd go to school one morning and somebody would have to bring up, "Did you hear what Danny Williams said this morning?" It was always something like, "Did you hear what Danny said?" It was a big part of the culture there at that time, the late 60s, early 70s. I remember about the only thing Danny said during his morning show that I remember clearly is one time he came on after a record and said, "This is Dan D. Dynamo in the Space Science Center, currently orbiting the Earth at an altitude of 6 feet. Our mission, look for tall broads." It was that kind of thing that kind of endeared us to the whole WKY experience. Then later on, after I got out of high school, I enrolled in one of our vocational technical schools in Enid, Oklahoma, and studied electrical engineering. Did that for a couple of years, and as I was finishing up my studies, I also played bass in a cover band that played high school dances and clubs on the weekend. And we got a bit of notoriety around, central and northern Oklahoma and southern Kansas. And I recall that's how I first met Ronnie K. Ronnie K had heard about us and contacted us and said, could you be one of the bands that I plug on the air in return for letting me come to your gigs and make personal appearances, sell t-shirts, promote the station, that sort of thing. And so we said fine, and he did do that for quite a few of our gigs. And I remember this one incident. This was after we had been playing gigs for a while. Ronnie K was going to do segments on his show The Scene, where he had some of his local bands come on and appear on TV, and he invited us to do that. But it was essential, he said, just because of the logistics of doing a television show at that time, that we needed to have a track to lip sync to, that it was just too much of a logistical nightmare to do, to mic every band and do it live. So we said, all right, and our manager made plans for us to go into a little recording studio in Stillwater, Oklahoma, I think, and record a few cover tunes. And it turned out that one of the tunes we were going to do, our lead singer, he couldn't get all the words. He didn't know all the words to the song, and he didn't have the record, and in that little town at that time there wasn't a record store, and there wasn't time to drive to some big town like Enid, Oklahoma, and get one. And our manager at the time and our lead singer said, "Well, here's what we'll do. Well, let's call Ronnie K at the station and see if he can get the words for us." And I heard about this later, and I thought that was a pretty bold move on their part. But sure enough, they called Ronnie K up at the station, And Ronnie was on the air at that time. And he said, well, okay, let me find the record. And while he was playing another record on the air, he found the record, queued it up on the Q channel of his board, and listened to it in sections and said, okay, here's the first verse. And he recited the words to our lead singer over the phone so we could have the words for the recording session for his TV show. That was pretty cool. And it was pretty cool going to the station that time and being on TV. All us young band members would stand in line in front of the dressing room, and Ron's wife, Deanna, would sit us down and put makeup on all of us and tell us how to act. And it was a pretty well orchestrated affair. Anyway, I had gotten out of electronics school, and I was working at a TV repair shop in Enid. And I had decided that I wanted to get into broadcasting somehow. I had a good friend who was working a night shift at one of the radio stations there in Enid, and I used to hang out with him at the station and observe how broadcasting was done. So I thought I'd get into radio, and I contacted radio stations around the area, and it really didn't get much interest. And so I thought I'd cast my net out and write some letters to some local TV stations. And I remember John Bushnell, the chief engineer there at WKY-TV, he called me back and he said, well, you know, I'm looking for somebody, some entry-level engineer. Would you come down for an interview? So I came down for an interview and talked to John and toured the station. I took his technical test, which I don't know. I don't think I did all that well at it, but there were some things I knew, and I had picked up some broadcast terminology from my friend who worked in radio. So, to my great surprise, like a week or two later, John Bushnell called me back and said, "I want to hire you." And I said, "Well, okay." Here I was, this young kid. I was just 20 years old with no experience in TV, but John Bushnell decided to take a risk, take a chance with me. So I packed my few possessions in my car and drove down to Oklahoma City. And my first day on the job was June 3rd, 1974. And I worked that first day on the job. That's where I met Roy Ramirez. At first they said, well, maybe we'll train you to do audio because you have an interest in that. So Roy Ramirez sat me down at the audio console in the on-air control. He was running the board on the morning cut-ins at that time. And Billy Nix was the director, sitting there reading the newspaper, waiting for time to do, I think, the 8:25 news cut-in. And Roy kind of quizzed me on some basic techniques, you know, how would you balance these two microphones, that sort of thing. And when it came time for the 8:25, he said, well, I'll let you run it. And so the newscaster at the time, I believe his name was Dick Nelson, was doing the news cut-in, and with Roy Ramirez looking over my shoulder and me being very nervous, I turned the mics on and brought them up, played the announcer cartridge, and did all that stuff. And I guess I did all right. But about an hour later, John Bushnell came by and said, oh, well, Pat, we talked it over, and we think we'd rather have you start in video control, shading the cameras instead of doing audio because, you know, don't take this wrong, but we think you could probably do less damage there, if you know what I mean. And I said, all right, and I walked into the technical area where the cameras were all adjusted and controlled, and met Aaron Britton, who was the senior video man at the time. And I worked at that post for several months and kind of rotated through all the operational jobs that an engineer did, such as working in the videotape room, doing tape editing for productions, and also got back into running the soundboard for commercial production, which we did a lot of in those days, and also running audio on the newscasts, and got to know a lot of people. At WKY-TV, we were very proud of our leadership position, our history of doing color television very early. All the way back to 1954, the station got two of the very first examples of the RCA TK40A cameras, which were huge, used huge image orthicon tubes, and required a lot of effort to get set up and making really good pictures. And that was where Aaron Britton got his reputation for making beautiful video. Now, I had no experience with those cameras, and in fact, I had no experience with the cameras that came next. Around 1967, WKY-TV then retired the TK40As and got the RCA TK42 cameras, which were a little smaller, still pretty large cameras, but they used those for several years afterwards. In 1969, WKY-TV got their first color mobile unit, which at the time I believe had General Electric cameras. But by the time I started in 1974, they were very proud of their new studio cameras, which were made by the Marconi Company in Chelmsford, England. They were the model Mark 8. I know some people may tell you that, it was unprecedented for this company to sell cameras in the United States, but that's not entirely true. They have some history with the U.S. television. I had read that ABC TV had bought some of the early Marconi black and white cameras back in the 1960s and used those for various purposes. And a previous color model, which was called the Mark 7, was used by CBS. They bought several of them for their New York studio where they did the Ed Sullivan Show. When Ed Sullivan first went color, they used Marconi cameras there. The ones we had were the Mark 8 model, which were a smaller, more compact camera. Yeah, I suppose today with home camcorders being so good, you might look at the video we made then and go, not so great. But for the day, they made a beautiful picture. And the station had bought 10 of the cameras. We used 6 of them in the studios and had 4 of them out in the mobile unit. And we used them in just about every situation you could think of. And for the most part, they worked really well. They had a few shortcomings, which became apparent as we got used to them, but they were not shortcomings that we couldn't overcome, and for the most part, they were really good cameras. A lot of the engineers that I met when I first started at WKY-TV had been with the station from the beginning. People like Bob Hayward, Louis Parks, Willard Hines, and of course the chief engineer, John Bushnell, had come over from KVOO in Tulsa a few years previously. I was really impressed that those old-timers treated a green young kid like me with quite a bit of respect and patience. A lot of patience was required as I was getting my feet wet, and getting up to speed on broadcast television as it was done at that time. Of course, WKY radio was right upstairs, and so I got to meet and know a few of the DJs. Not only Ronnie K, but Don Wallace. Of course, Danny Williams, that goes without saying. He was doing his Danny's Day program every day around midday. And there was no way we could avoid being exposed to Danny Williams. Absolutely. He was quite a unique individual. For one thing, he could always come up with a quip right off the top of his head. There was one incident where they were right in the middle of a Danny's Day show, and inexplicably, all the lights went off. I have no idea why the lights went off, but in fact, I may have even been watching it at home. That's why I didn't know what went on. But they were in the middle of the show, and all of a sudden the screen went black, and the next words to come out of the speaker were, "OG&E hates us." Then the lights came back on, and everybody had a good laugh. There were quite a few good people in the news department in those days. I remember when I first started at WKY-TV, the news department was sequestered in a small area in the south end of the building. People like Jack Ogle, George Tomic, Brad Edwards, Steve Newman, Ron Turner. They did some great work, especially considering some of the constraints they worked with at the time. And they're really good at shooting film. Daryl Barton, news photographer. He was an award-winning photographer, and in fact, after he left Channel 4, he continued as a freelancer and traveled all over the world shooting news. He was greatly in demand for quite a few years. And I remember Steve Newman and Ron Turner were the two main guys in those days who shot and edited a lot of the film for the human interest stories and the like 4 or 5 minute feature stories that I think they referred to them as mini docs or mini documentaries. But at the time we had a 1 a.m. newscast that came on, let's see, we had the Tonight Show after the news, and after the Tonight Show, we ran NBC's Tomorrow Show with Tom Snyder. And after Tom Snyder was the 1 a.m. short 5-minute newscast that we did right before sign-off. And I do remember at certain times, Steve Newman was assigned to do the 1 a.m. news, and he might have been at the station putting in like 24 to 36 hours without sleep, feverishly editing film for some project. And so he would get on camera on the air, and he would be maybe a little bit out of it when he was doing the 1 a.m. news. He was a trooper, but I do remember at some time, I do remember on some occasions that those news guys really burned the midnight oil. It was mostly men in the newsroom. We did have Pam Henry, who was quite a little firecracker. I recall the first day I showed up at Channel 4 for my job interview, sitting in the lobby, and I saw Pam come out to greet some guests that she was going to interview, and it was quite interesting. It was a bit of a shock to see that she walked with crutches because of her disability, but she had a big smile on her face, and she didn't seem to let that bother her. And I remarked to myself that, of course, they did not say anything about her physical issues on the air, and I think the viewers never knew. So that kind of showed me something about the magic of television. That television can kind of show you what it wants you to see sometimes. Back in '74, we did the news from the black set. That's what we called it. the news set was designed to be a total black limbo, and the design was made to pretty much put the focus on the news person, the weather person, and the sports person. And in fact, for the open, they would roll the opening music, and the newsman, like for instance Jack Ogle, would be standing there behind his podium in black limbo, and as the announcer announced the names of the weather and sports person, they would turn on their own lights in turn, and they would appear on the screen, and then they would turn their lights back off, and the camera would zoom into the newsman. I remember an incident with Jack Ogle. Jack Ogle used to like to smoke his pipe while he was doing the news, and he would set his pipe right next to him, and he would take a few puffs on it during the commercial breaks, like that. And I remember more than once the director would tell the camera operator to give him a 10-second cue to go back to him, and he would look up and realize that there was pipe smoke all around him. So more than once I would be looking at the monitor and seeing Jack Ogle going like this, trying to clear the smoke away before they came back to him. That was a little bit comical. I first met Bella Shaw in 1974. It was the first year I worked there. She was a very young lady at the time, working, doing the news at WKY Radio. And I recall her at the time seeming very quiet, very shy. She had long brown hair, long brown, very straight hair at that time, and looked for all the world like a shy child of nature. And it was a little interesting for me to see her when she came back a few years later to work in TV news, how she had become this very confident, outgoing personality that you saw on TV. Billy Nix, a director at Channel 4, he directed a lot of the morning and midday newscasts and had a very quick wit. He was always coming up with some kind of a joke or a quip. Like I remember I was standing in the control room with him once, and there was this really bombastic commercial for some Chevrolet dealership on the air at the time. And when it was over, I said, "Gee, Billy, do you think they're going to sell many Chevrolets with that?" And he turned to me and said, "I don't know, but I'm going to sell mine." Bill Thrash was the assistant program director and then the program director during the time I was there. One thing I always respected him for was his commitment to local programming. For one thing, he was very keen on finding good movies for us to run in some of the evenings and on weekends. And also he championed a lot of local shows. Like he persuaded John Ferguson to reprise his Count Gregor character for the late night Saturday night movies called Sleepwalkers Matinee. And I helped with a lot of those productions. We would tape the segments for a couple of different weekends of an evening, and he and some of his friends that he would bring to be on the show really did a lot of imaginative skits and comedy bits for the transitions leading into the commercial breaks on the movies. And it was at some point while we were doing Sleepwalkers Matinee that somebody came up with the idea that we could, by using a device called a chroma keyer and a blue screen, that we could insert the count into the last frame of that segment of the movie. And so what we would do is John would watch the last few minutes of each segment of a movie before the commercial break. We pre-taped all this stuff, so it was possible. And then we kind of decided how he was going to enter the movie, and we would still frame the last frame of that segment of the movie and insert the count into the scene. Like, for instance, if the last scene before the commercial break was a scene of a room with a window in the center of the screen, we might have the count climb in through the window or appear at the window, make some kind of a joke or comment, and then we would dissolve to black and it would go into the commercial break. Or we would have the count walk into the scene, or do stuff like that. And if it was done just right, when we ran the segments as we ran the movie, the master control operator would have it timed. He would be watching the film go through the projector, and just at the moment, just before the film ran out, he would roll the segment, and to the viewer it would look like the movie just froze, and then the count would walk into the scene and do his bit. It was brilliant. We did that for quite a while, for several months there. And it was pretty imaginative. There was a lady named Fran Morris, I remember, who would do the Sunday morning children's Sunday school show that we produced at Channel 4. And I think it was Bill Thrash who had the idea to kind of expand her role. And we started a show called Miss Fran, which had an entire set. And Fran was the host of the show. And Hy Roberts was on the show. He appeared as characters, and he was also a puppeteer. He would voice and do the puppets on the show. And it was kind of the same theme. It was a children's show teaching things like good behavior and manners and things like that. And we did the Miss Fran show for several years, and it was quite popular. It was, once again, that was part of Bill Thrash's commitment to local programming. Another thing that Bill Thrash championed was getting in on a thing called PM Magazine, which was sort of a combination local and national show. And that PM Magazine had a national office and national stories that were contributed by all the stations that did it. But we also had local hosts. I think we started out with Karen Carney and Stan Miller, who were the hosts. And Kareem E. Kareem was the executive producer of the show. And they had their own little set of video equipment, and they would go out and shoot open and close and host segments and stories. And there were a number of stories that they did locally that ended up on the national PM Magazine reel and was seen all over the country. And well, that was just an example of maybe how more localized television was in those days. WKY-TV was the production house for the syndicated Buck Owens show. And one thing that I always kind of regret a little bit, and that is that I wasn't there whenever they were shooting the actual shows, the actual segments that were put together into shows. The last time that Buck and his band had been at the station was in the fall of '73, and I didn't get there until the spring of '74. And, well, tragically, it was shortly after I started working there that Buck Owens' singing partner and guitar player, Don Rich, was killed in a motorcycle accident. And I think that after that happened, Buck just didn't want to do any shows. So after I was there, although we didn't shoot any more studio segments, there was still quite a bit of editing and post-production to be done on the stuff that was already shot. And there was a man named Pete Richmond there at Channel 4 who handled all the booking of the production sessions and handled the receipt and shipping off of videotapes and the distribution of the Buck Owens show, for one thing. So for a couple of years after that, we were still shipping out original Buck Owens shows. And then after that ran out, the people behind the show decided to sort of shuffle the existing segments together into a new set of shows called The Best of Buck Owens. So we syndicated The Best of Buck Owens for several years after that. Well, after I had been at Channel 4 for about 2 years, I think I proved myself well enough to be deemed worthy to go out on remote shoots with the 40-foot remote truck. And golly, I worked on probably just about every kind of remote you can think of, from entertainment remotes to football, baseball, basketball, hockey, golf, soccer. I did that for several years, and you know, I think if studio work builds up your skills, remote work builds up your endurance. It really is kind of a baptism of fire. But if you can work outside remotes in television, you can do just about anything. I remember an incident with the WKY-TV mobile unit, which was a big deal. Bob Hayward was driving it back from a shoot at Evans Furniture when they got into an accident with a milk tanker truck, and it just tore the trailer all to heck. And this was a big deal because we were supposed to do the first OSU football game in 8 or 9 days. And you know, it was a commitment, and what were we going to do? I think there wasn't time to get another remote truck in. So the Channel 4 engineering staff, what they did was they stripped the trailer of all of its equipment, brought it into the garage, and rented a furniture mover trailer, and installed all the equipment in this rented trailer, including the air conditioner, the racks, the camera control units, the videotape machine, the switcher, the audio console, all that stuff. And they worked around the clock, and they accomplished it in a week. And they were ready to go to do the game on time, and it came off. I remember at the time people from all over the station were pitching in, doing what they could. Production people, camera operators were showing up, you know, if they could help string cable out or anything like that. I remember at the time I had been there such a short time and was so green. I remember showing up in the garage and asking, is there anything I can do to help? And I was told that the best thing I could do to help them was to get out of the way. So that's what I did. I got out of their way, and they got it done. I recall the break room, the lounge there at WKY-TV. Everybody referred to it as the coffee shop. And I guess before I got there, it used to be a full-service cafeteria. It was run by a lady named Imogene Jones. But by the time I got there, although Imogene was still there, back in those days, Norman Bagwell, the general manager, sort of was really reluctant to let people go. If there was any way he could keep somebody on staff, he would do it. And that's an attitude that's kind of fallen by the wayside in modern business. One thing I can say about the atmosphere at WKY-TV during the time I was there between 1974 and 1986, but the attitude there was always, let's do the best job we can. Whatever we're doing, let's make it the best that it can be, the best we can. And that always stuck with me. When we were doing taped production, we would often do take after take of a commercial, and the mantra was one more time. I didn't quite get it right. Let's do it one more time. And I do remember that about Channel 4, and that was a kind of work ethic that I hope has stuck with me all these years. Well, it's been a treat talking to you about WKY-TV Channel 4 and my time there, and I hope maybe I told you something that you hadn't thought of in a long time. I'm Pat Bryant. Take care.